I still think about this encounter, even as an adult. When I was about 10, I'm 25 now, I was downstairs watching TV late at night with my mum and my sisters. Everyone decided to head off to bed, and I was left alone downstairs. I started drifting off, and all of a sudden, someone started banging on our door hard. I'm talking, let me the hell in hard. I was so scared. I just sat there frozen, staring at the door like my life depended on it. My dog was laying right next to me and also just stared. He never barked or moved an inch, which was odd because he always barked at the door. The banging never stopped for what seemed like a solid 5 minutes, but in reality, it was probably only a minute or so. I looked at my dog, and I think because I finally moved, my dog snapped out of his trance, looked at me for a split second, and jumped up and ran towards the door. He still didn't bark, but instead started turning his head like he was confused. I finally got the courage to get up and open the blinds to see what was going on, and this young woman, maybe around 20 to 25, was standing there, holding her left breast in her hand. It was still attached to her, but she had pretty large breasts, and she was holding it trying to keep them from sagging, I'm guessing. She had blonde hair, white skin, and was completely covered in blood. Her shirt was ripped, and her hair was a mess. I remember thinking, she may have gotten beaten up or was in a car crash. Either way, I immediately went to go and open the door. As soon as I went to unlock it, my mum, out of nowhere, slammed a hand on the door and relocked it. I had no idea she'd even come down the stairs, let alone walked up behind me. I was so focused on the door and on this woman that when she slammed a hand on it, it almost knocked me back into reality. The reality of not opening the door for strangers in the middle of the night. I looked up at her, and I could feel my eyes were wide, and I think I even started crying. She put a hand on my shoulder and moved me away from the door. She yelled, "Who is it?" through the door, and the girl yelled back that her boyfriend had beat her up, and they lived in the apartments across the street from us. Mind you, we lived in townhouses in a cul-de-sac. Our unit was all the way in the back where you would start the turn. We were the first unit in the row, but where she pointed out her and her boyfriend's place was at, was quite a way away from us. My mum asked her name, and she said something that sounded like something Annie, maybe Bethany or Stephanie or something like that. I saw my mum hesitate to open the door, but after she yelled, "Please help me," my mum opened the door, stepped out and pulled it close to shut it but not completely shut. I cracked the door behind her to make sure she was okay, and also to see what was going on. The woman, we'll call Bethany, kept thanking my mum and asking to come in because she was scared her boyfriend was going to come after her. My mum refused and explained that she couldn't let her in because of the safety of her 4 kids, but said she would sit outside with her. My mum yelled at me to grab the phone and call the police, so I did. My mum started asking her what happened and what specific unit she lived in. She pointed towards a specific one and told my mum the building number and her unit, which was B. Then, a silver SUV pulled up a little later and she ran towards it yelling, "That's my sister," and then just jumped in. The car sped off without another word from her or a single word from her sister. My mum looked back at me confused and came back inside and shut and locked the door. We just stood there and looked at each other. I asked my mum what about the police, and she said she would wait for them downstairs if I wanted to go to bed. I was too scared to leave her, so I waited with her. Once they arrived, my mum explained what happened, and the officer said she did the right thing not letting her inside. The weird thing is, my dog never barked once, until the cops knocked on the door. They also explained that they'd been receiving similar calls like that in the area recently. Even worse, the next morning we all packed up to go to the grocery store, and as we passed that building, you could tell the apartment was empty, like no one had been living in it. Maybe they just didn't have any furniture or anything, but it was still weird. Her boyfriend never came after her that night, and we never saw her or the SUV again. So Bethany, I hope you're okay, if this was real, but also if it's not. Don't ever knock on my door again. This next story will be narrated by Papa Scare. I'll link his YouTube channel in the description below. Please, subscribe to his channel. Thank you.
I was getting fed up with my neighbour. I'd only seen her once. Her relentlessly loud radio had my floor vibrating. I'd banged feverishly on the wall, and in response, she only turned it up louder. She listens to some evangelical AM Christian channel. I'm now an agnostic who can recite scripture more accurately than a devout Baptist. One night, I had to get to bed early for a 6:30 AM Zoom meeting, and I'd had enough. I stomped out of my apartment and angrily rapped my fist on her door. The radio went up another few notches before I began literally kicking her fucking door down. In this moment, the girl living across the hall from me opened her door in her pajamas, wiping her eyes in front of a dark living room. Obviously awakened from her slumber, brows furrowed with disdain. "God," she began. I thought maybe she was angry with me, but then she continued with, "It never ends with her." Just as I was about to respond, I heard the clicking of the doorknob behind me. The girl across the hall's look of horror said all I needed to know. When I turned to look at the woman, I was in shock. She must have been in her mid to late 50s. The first thing that pummeled my senses was the foul smell that instantly punched me in the face. Before I had even a moment to compute what the pungent odor might be, her appearance alone forced every hair on my body to stand at attention. Her hair was ratty and matted, sticking up and out on all sides like she'd intentionally stuck her fingers in a light socket. The tips were blood red, receding down to grey roots, looking like she hadn't dyed it in months. Her face was pale and weathered, leathery as some albino reptile. Cracks and lines all over like some map of the Mojave Desert. Nose like a bird beak, cheeks contoured and eyes with big black irises sunken into cavernous sockets in her head. She looked emaciated. What was most disquieting was that her stain-covered light blue robe was partially opened to a point of exposing her saggy left breast, dangling like a missile wrapped in a sack made of flesh. In her skeletal bony fingers was a long cigarette, 3/4 of the way smoked, but the ashes not flicked. She took a puff and blew it in my face, tapping the cigarette ashes to her floor without care. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. My veins were pulsating with dread when I got a look at her walls, all etched with a sharp object and drawn on with red and black marker crosses, both upright and upside down. Standing atop a muted TV emitting a picture of nothing but deep blue static hues was a giant wooden crucifix with Christ nailed to it, and scattered along her floor was garbage, from Chinese food containers to ripped open packs of baby wipes. Not a word was ever spoken. The look in her eyes said pure religious indoctrination and evil. A Christian nut with no regard for other people, her apartment, or hygiene. I know this, not just because of the hellscape that was her room, or the scent of what I later could only identify as roadkill emanating from some dark corner, but because of her teeth. She flashed me a mouthful of essentially broken, missing and rotting, elongated corn kernels before slamming the door in my face. I put in earplugs, but they were almost no help. I popped some Benadryl and despite the religious gibberish seeping through the walls, I was able to doze off in a state of extreme fatigue for just a little while. I awoke sometime later in the middle of the night to just silence. For the first time in my 3 weeks of living here, she'd turned off her radio. The calmness was actually eerie. But I was about to be faced with something I had not ever seen even in my worst nightmares. I awoke, on top of my covers, shoes still on, facing my bedroom door, which was wide open. I'd never leave it open. Ever since I was a child, I'd been terrified of dark hallways, and this night was only a justification of my phobia. Amidst the warm glow of my hallway nightlight, I found myself in what I thought at first was only a bad dream, until my hoodie zipper stung me as it pricked out one of my arm hairs. I wasn't dreaming. In my doorway was the dark silhouette of a figure staring down at me. The wild, matted outline of hair told me that it was one of two things: an evil clown or my psychotic neighbor. The wafting scent of cigarettes and ash confirmed the latter. I was frozen, unable to speak or move. Her eyes were wide and bulging from their sockets. From the little that I could make out, I could see the expression of fury in her gaze.
"You really should leave your door locked,"
she muttered in a deep, scratchy voice. A voice irreparably marred from decades of inhaling carcinogens, and it was utterly unnerving. I could see that she was grasping something in her hand, but she turned and walked out before I got a chance to make it out. I was petrified, frozen and unable to draw a single breath. I didn't sleep well that night. Not at all, in fact. The very next day I spoke to the landlord. The words barely escaped my lips before his face degraded from passivity to rage, and he spat angrily the words,
"That's it. I've had enough of that old bitch. Her sister promised she'd keep her in check."
I asked what he meant when he said sister, but he thrust a shovel over his shoulder and huffed off on his haunches to the management office. I hadn't even had a chance to tell him about the smell. Only one more day had passed before the odor got so bad I could hear people opening their doors one by one and loudly discussing it. I could sense unease in one older lady's voice. I was on my way out the door to go to my girlfriend's house. On the way out, I saw the girl from across the hall talking to the others. "I don't know what the smell is, but I saw her dragging something to the dumpster." Of course, I was thinking what all of you are right now. It's her dead sister. But no. She said it was a small bag, the size of maybe a cat or miniature dog. I left for the night and got home around 3 p.m. the next day. Police were all over the parking lot and, as you could imagine, littered throughout my hallway.
"I'm sorry, sir, but this is a crime scene. If you need to grab some of your things, that's fine. But for the next few hours, we need you to find somewhere else to go."
I came home later that night to find her room covered in police tape and a small gathering of residents congregating in the hallway. I immediately joined them, and what I found out was utterly nightmarish. The police were called on her after she'd dragged another stinky garbage bag to the dumpster. So a neighbor named Joy's husband William went out there with gloves and ripped into it. In the bag, he discovered a hand. He didn't look further. It turns out the woman named Lois was a violent schizophrenic. She had lived with her sister, but she died one night, apparently in her sleep. Lois, speaking fast like a meth fiend, was heard explaining to police that she didn't have anywhere to bury her, so she cut her to pieces with a variety of knives and a box cutter after having a vigil in the grace of God for her sister in her living room. She said she hadn't let anyone know because she didn't want her sister to leave. I still don't know why she was placed in handcuffs, but I presume it's because of her mental illness and she was being transported to a mental hospital. though I wonder if it was for something else. Maybe her sister hadn't just died in her sleep. Why do I think this? Because another neighbour, a guy about my age in his mid-20s named Cameron, told me a blood-chilling story. He said that one night, a few weeks ago, he was watching TV with his fiancée, when, all of a sudden, he heard a noise. The floor of his living room creaking behind him. He turned around to find Lois, standing in the doorway, brandishing an opened box cutter. And what she said, I'll never forget.
You shouldn't leave your door unlocked. You never know who might live next to you.
Before turning and walking out. Now I know what she had in her hand the night she visited me. He called the police, and they said they couldn't just knock on her door and arrest her, but if she ever leaves her apartment, they could. I'm not sure how much they needed to clean in her apartment, but it was 2 months before I got another neighbor, an elderly couple. Now it's quieter, and my door is always locked, but still, in my nightmares, it never is.